Ishmael was the firstborn son of Abraham with Hagar. His mother, Hagar, was an Egyptian servant of Sarah, Abraham's wife. God had promised Abraham that he would give him numerous descendants, even though he was already advanced in age. But Sarah was barren, and according to the customs of that time, she offered her servant Hagar to Abraham so that an heir could be born for the family. This is how the biblical story of Ishmael begins, and in this video, we will understand who Ishmael truly was according to the Bible. So, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, take this opportunity to do so now, activate all notifications, and let's dive into the video. When Ishmael was born, Abraham was already 86 years old, and according to the biblical texts, we can see that Abraham loved Ishmael, and even asked God to consider him as the promised heir. But when Ishmael was about 13 years old, God renewed his promise to Abraham, who at that point was 99 years old. Once again, God promised that he would give Abraham a descendant through his own wife, Sarah, and also commanded that all the men in his household be circumcised as a sign of his covenant. Since Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised, some Arab tribes still practice circumcision for their youth at this age. About a year later, Isaac was born. The birth of Sarah and Abraham's biological son led to a series of relationship problems between Sarah and Hagar. In fact, even before Ishmael was born, Sarah and Hagar had already had disagreements. The biblical text states that after becoming pregnant, Hagar began to despise Sarah. At that point, Hagar was completely in the wrong, because according to the laws of that time, a fertile servant was never allowed to oppose the barren wife. If this happened, the special servant chosen to bear the family heir could be demoted to the status of an ordinary servant. Thus, according to this custom, Sarah had the right to mistreat Hagar for her contempt. Regardless, Hagar ended up fleeing to the desert out of fear of Sarah. But in the desert, the angel of the Lord appeared to her and commanded her to return to Abraham's household. It was also in the desert that the angel told her that the son she was carrying would be named Ishmael. That is why the name Ishmael means God hears, because the Lord heard Hagar's affliction, as we read in Genesis 16:11. But the conflict between Sarah and Hagar reached its peak when Isaac was weaned. At Isaac's weaning celebration, Ishmael ended up mocking Isaac. Sarah was very offended and demanded that Abraham send Hagar and her son away, as we read in Genesis 21. This request from Sarah went against the customs of the time, as, according to the regulations of that era, Ishmael was a legitimate son not only of Abraham, but also of Sarah, since he had been conceived by her personal servant. In extreme cases, the son of a master with a servant could be demoted in status within the family unit, but never expelled. Obviously, all of this caused great distress to Abraham, but God once again spoke to the patriarch of Israel and assured him that he should not be worried about Isaac. The Lord assured Abraham that he would take care of the servant's son and also give him a great lineage. The biblical text does not provide details about everything involved or what motivated Sarah's request to expel Ishmael and Hagar. But it seems that more than any specific action by Ishmael, Sarah viewed him as a threat to her biological son's position within the family. So, after being comforted by the Lord, Abraham sent Hagar and her son away. They left with bread and water, but at a certain point, the water ran out, and they thought they would die. The Bible even says that at that moment, Hagar placed Ishmael under a tree and moved away so as not to see him die. At this point, people often imagine that Ishmael was a small child, but he was most likely a teenager, around 16 years old. Still, in Genesis 21, we read that God rescued both Hagar and Ishmael. Once again, he renewed his promise that Ishmael would become a prosperous man. Ishmael then lived with his mother in the wilderness of Beersheba, and later in the wilderness of Paran. Although Isaac remained as Abraham's only heir, Ishmael and the other children Abraham had outside his marriage with Sarah were also provided for by him, as we read in Genesis 25. This means that both Hagar's son, Ishmael, and Keturah's children all received material gifts from the patriarch. And although there was discord among Ishmael, Isaac, Hagar, and Sarah, the Bible does not record any further conflict between Ishmael and Isaac as adults. In fact, the two appear together in the biblical text of Genesis 25 as the ones responsible for Abraham's burial in the cave of Machpelah. The Bible concludes Ishmael's story by noting that he became a great hunter. He was very skilled with a bow and arrow, and Hagar found an Egyptian wife for him, with whom he had 12 sons and 1 daughter. Later, based on Genesis 28 and 36, we understand that Ishmael's daughter married Esau, Isaac's son. The names of Ishmael's sons are listed in Genesis 25, 13, 15, and most of these names are mentioned in other biblical passages as tribal families of some influence at that time. In fact, Ishmael's descendants are generally identified in the Bible as Ishmaelites. They were organized into 12 tribes that lived in mobile camps in the southern desert. The Bible also states in Genesis 25 that Ishmael died at the age of 137, but it does not mention where he was buried, although Muslim tradition claims he was buried in Mecca. Finally, in the New Testament, Ishmael is especially referenced by the Apostle Paul. In chapter 4 of his letter to the Galatians, Paul used the figure of the son of the servant in his allegories about the opposition of legalistic religious leaders who persecuted Gentile believers, those born of the Spirit and enjoying freedom in Christ. Over time, the name Ishmael became relatively common. Thus, other individuals in the Bible are mentioned with the name Ishmael. For instance, there was a descendant of King Saul and Prince Jonathan named Ishmael. There was also a high official during King Jehoshaphat's reign and the son of a priest during Ezra's time. But among all those mentioned, besides Hagar's son, the most notable was Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, who was part of the royal house of David. During the time of Babylonian oppression against the Jews, this Ishmael assassinated Gedaliah, the governor of Judah, appointed by Nebuchadnezzar, as recorded in 2 Kings 25 and also in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, chapters 40 and 41. To conclude our study on the story of Ishmael in the Bible, we can highlight some main points. Ishmael was not the son promised by God to Abraham, but God still cared for him. It was the Lord who chose Ishmael's name and destined him for greatness, even though he was outside the covenant. Ishmael was blessed with a great lineage, which was also organized into a tribal structure of 12 clans, similar to Isaac's descendants. Ishmael's character was described by God in a way that emphasized the nomadic life of his descendants and the opposition his people would have against the children of the covenant. Over time, Ishmael's descendants joined the Midianites, who were also Abraham's descendants through Keturah, making the Ishmaelites and Midianites essentially the same people in various biblical passages. Today, the Arab people trace their lineage to Abraham primarily through Ishmael. Finally, in a broader sense, Ishmael's story in the Bible goes far beyond a personal biography. His story, contrasted with Isaac's, reveals much about God's work and the outpouring of His grace in the history of redemption. Ishmael was the natural birth from the relationship of 2 fertile people, Abraham and Hagar. Isaac, on the other hand, was the supernatural birth that revealed God's great power, allowing a 90-year-old barren woman to bear a child. This helps explain Paul's indirect reference to Ishmael in the New Testament, portraying him as the one born according to the flesh, in contrast to the one born according to the Spirit.